And then you go on in Romans 13 and he says this, hey, if what you do distresses your brother or sister, that is eating or not eating, then you are no longer doing it out of love. So he says the real issue in eating or drinking or weak conscience and strong conscience and having certain convictions that other people don't share is this, it's love. It's, am I going to love you or am I going to be selfish? Am I going to use my ways to do whatever I want to do to get my way? Or am I going to say, man, your conscience, your soul, your heart is more important than drinking that thing or going to this place or doing that kind of activity? And then he goes on to, at the end of chapter 13 of Romans, and he says this. He says, hey, and so therefore you need to make sure you're just not a stumbling block to your brother. In other words, don't do anything or do any activity in front of someone who would have an issue with it. And he says, at the end of the day, everybody's going to be judged by God. And so let's quit judging each other about those things. And he says, if we can get to that place where we're not judging people and we're doing things out of love, we'll understand that all food is good. Nothing's wrong with the food. Nothing's wrong with certain activities. There's nothing inherently wrong if it's not on the guardrails, if it's not biblically clear, but it is if it invades somebody else's conscience, if it invades somebody else's convictions, if it causes somebody else to go away from God instead of for God. And I want you to understand, I'll give you an example. My mother is big time like no drinking at all. My mother, she grew up in a home where her dad was an alcoholic or at least borderline. And man, alcohol to her is a deal where you don't drink around her, you don't do it. It's a horrible thing. It's completely sinful at all places, at all times. And it's a deal because she has this psychological deal from when she was a kid. And when her dad came to a personal relationship with Christ, alcohol went out the window, and she associates with a lot of bad, awful things. And alcohol is very dangerous if it's not used right. Okay, I have a very strong conscience when it comes to alcohol. So I can control that. That's not a big deal to me, but I would never in a million years drink around my mother. I would never talk about my alcohol use around my mother. I would never ever tell her certain things because why? She has a weak conscience. I have a strong conscience on it. And so what he's saying here in Colossians is, listen, I want you to understand something. Don't let anyone judge you as it relates to eating or drinking. Don't do the Jesus plus some deprivation plan. You got to go with your conscience and where you are in your relationship with Jesus. It's Jesus plus nothing. And then he goes on at the end of verse 16, and he says another thing. He says, hey, and by the way, don't let somebody judge you with regard to, and then he starts, look at this, a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. And you're like, what are those? Okay, so basically what was going on in the Colossae region and the people that were living there is this. Okay, they had these certain days. They saw it as like Jesus plus certain days. I would say Jesus plus traditions. And so, man, they had some of these festivals that were religious festivals from Judaism and things that we read about that the Jews did before God in the Old Testament. Plus, they had some of these pagan festivals, like a new moon celebration where they basically, worshiped the moon and the moon god of the pagans. And then they also had like certain people believed that you should keep the Sabbath on Sunday. Certain people thought that you didn't have to. And so there were all these days and all these rituals that were absolutely like Jesus plus these extra things. And what Paul is telling these people is this, listen, it is not Jesus plus traditions. And some of you grew up in a church where there were certain weeks of the year or certain times of the year, like maybe Lent, and you do certain things or you don't do certain things. And you say, man, where did that come from? Tradition. I grew up in Southern Baptist world, in hardcore Southern Baptist world. And so you say, why is there a piano and an organ and people in robes? Answer, tradition. Why is it that we do certain things in churches the way we do? Some people say that you have to meet for church on Sunday because that's the day that Christ rose from the tomb. Other people say you should meet on Saturday because that's the day that Jesus held the Sabbath. So we need to hold the Sabbath and we need to have church services on Saturday.